So good morning officially. My name is Kristin Anderson, and I'm the Director of Professional Learning for Corwin Press. And we are very excited that you have joined us early in the Pacific time zone, that is, this Thursday morning to discuss visible learning in general and assessment-capable learners in particular. Today, joining me is my esteemed colleague, Ainsley Rose, and Ainsley is featured here on this slide, and he has been a primary consultant for conducting the visible learning work in the field. The two of us are excited to bring this content to you this morning. So I have a question to get us started today, and that question is one that we just want you to respond to within the chat function. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest possible knowledge that could exist in the world, you are wise, you are the guru, and 1 being I know absolutely nothing, where would you rank yourself on your knowledge of visible learning and the research? On a scale of 1 to 10, are you are starting at the bottom and you're learning for the first time, or you had so much wisdom and experience you are the expert at the 10. So just take about 30 seconds and chat to us your ranking of your visible learning knowledge. The responses are coming in. We really appreciate them. It's helping us to know who we're talking with today. I'm going to give you about 15 more seconds. Again, if you just joined us, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the wisest guru there is possible, where would you rate yourself as to your knowledge and wisdom about the visible learning research and work? All right, wonderful. Well, we really appreciate all these responses and appreciate you taking your time to send them to us. So we're going to start by just leveling the playing field and helping everyone understand what it is we're talking about and how we got to this webinar. So the first exciting announcement that we are delighted to share with all of our clients is, as of July, Corwin has become the official partner to bring visible learning, workshops, services, products, seminars, consulting, coaching, everything and anything to all of North America. So if you wish to engage in any of the work that is derived from John Hattie's research-based, Corwin is now the exclusive place to engage in that work. And honestly, as an organization, we couldn't be any more thrilled to be able to provide this work to the field, as we view visible learning as the lens that helps everything in teaching and learning and leadership make sense. So we are definitely along an exciting journey. And what we wanted to do with you this morning to kind of kick things off and get us into assessment-capable learners was to highlight the research base and where it came from and the findings. So first of all, back in 2009, there was a white book that was published that you see on your screen, simply titled Visible Learning. And visible learning started because John Hattie at the University of Auckland at the time desired to help schools, districts, ministries of education make well-informed decisions about the professional development, the services, workshops, whatever the case is that clients chose to engage in. and really helping schools make informed decisions instead of what appeared to be a large buffet that schools were going to and choosing, I want a little bit of this professional development, I want a little bit of that, that looks good. He wanted to know why people were making the choices they were making and if they had the knowledge base to really make those decisions with some solid basis behind those decisions. So he sought to analyze almost 150 influences at the time on teaching, learning, and leadership, and look at which of those influences had a direct impact on student achievement and what that impact was. So at the time that the White Book came out in 2009, originally the work was 800 meta-analysis, and at the time that was unparalleled research in the field of education. No one had come close to looking at that many influences in teaching, learning, and leadership with that massive amount of research behind it. Classroom Instruction That Works, that came out in 2001, was a synthesis of some meta-analysis and some studies, but we're talking about a comparison that is definitely a much larger one in respect. So over time, John has added to this database of research from the original findings, and to date, I believe he announced last month that he's at 1,079 meta-analysis in his database with over 50,000 studies and over 300 million students that he's examined, and this is around the world. And this pretty much blows my mind, and I know that we definitely have heard that in comparison to that 2001 work, that Hattie sometimes is referred to in the field as Marzano on steroids, meaning that he has taken the practice of meta-analysis and blown it out of the water to give us the best research base possible, the best gold standard for decision making in our field. And that's why we couldn't be any more honored to partner. So over the course of the last 4 years, there has been other resources that came out to kind of hone in on this point. The original book was created to be a reference guide for people as they were looking at different practices within schooling and to determine which ones work and work best. The Blue Book, as you see here on this slide, was written in 2011, and that book was intended to focus on the practices that work best and help put those within a framework and a lens to help people really understand how to implement them more and deeply. And then over the course of last year, another book came out, which is entitled The International Guide to Student Achievement, that looks at the influences John has studied and partners with professors around the world to kind of help explain those influences and practices beyond. There are many other books in the works in the Hattie Reference Collection, and all of this, again, leads to the gold standard or research base of what works and what works best. So in Hattie's research, basically what he was able to do is take studies that showed an impact on student achievement and place those studies and the findings on a common scale to look at. And the way he was able to place those on a common scale was by assigning an effect size to the practices that he studied. And so the effect size that he noticed was the hinge point in this research was a 0.40, meaning that 0.40 is approximately 1 year's growth over 1 year time in the field of education in a typical classroom. Anything higher than that means increased student achievement over that same period of time, and anything lower than that can mean anywhere from typical growth and effects to almost an adverse impact on student achievement. So essentially, he created a barometer to help us understand this concept in a heightened way. And what he found was that in the 0.4 to 1.0, this is what he called the zone of desired effects. Because essentially, if 0.4 is the standard deviation or the 1 year's growth over 1 year time, then anything higher than that is what every child in every education system deserves. They deserve at least 1 year's growth over 1 year's time in our care, and desirably more as we seek to close achievement gaps and to give every child a world-class education. Also, he noticed that there is a zone from 0.2 to 0.4 that is the typical teacher effects. These are the effects that you get a little bit of progress. It's not 1 year's growth over 1 year's time, but there's some progress that is made, and that is what a typical or an average teacher, that type of growth that they would get with a student over time. Then there's actually the zone from 0 to below 0.2, which is developmental effects or can be equated with maturation. And essentially noting that it doesn't matter who would be in the classroom during that time, because the student is growing, because the student is getting older, they would have that type of growth or progress made anyway. So if there was a policeman in the classroom, or if there was a trained teacher coming out of teacher education program, that type of effect would still happen. And then there are a few effects that actually cause a student to digress over time in his findings. But the biggest notion from the research is, that 95% of everything John studied within the 149 influences included in the first book and beyond is that 95% of everything studied works. There is some sort of effect or impact on 95% of what was studied that actually shows some sort of growth made. But the key is we look at that dial is that growth higher than a 0.40, or is that growth that would be the result of average teacher effects or developmental effects? And overarching in all of this is, if 95% of the influences he studied work, they're above a 0 in this scale, then how do we know and how do we focus on what actually works best? So this slide shows you the top 10. If I could get a drum roll, please. These rank the top 10 influences per the research today. As I hinted, John has over time added to the research base, and the ranking has slightly changed, meaning, you know, maybe going one practice, going down a couple in rank or whatever the case is. But this is the most current research we have about the top 10 influences that actually get the highest impact on student achievement. And if you look at 10 being feedback with a 0.75, that's almost 2 times the standard deviation, or in general could be equated to 2 years growth over 1 year of time. So these 10 practices actually empower us as educators to propel our students forward and get dramatic growth and dramatic gains in mighty ways. So you will see that among this top 10, we have items such as micro-teaching, where I'm filming my teaching, I'm going back and dissecting that teaching to really improve my practice. Response to intervention being somewhat new, and in addition to the very first book that came out with a very high effect size. And then you'll see in the top spot actual student expectations, self-reported grades, and assessment-capable learners. And the essence of this, when the research first came out and then was further explained, was these students, if you were to give them an assessment and you were to ask them before they took the assessment, what score would you get on this test? They could tell you the exact score that they would get on that assessment before they would take it, because they're very keen to what knowledge they already know, what they don't know, why they know it, why they don't know it, and how they will perform. And so these students are basically those that are incredibly in tune with their learning, and these are the ones that we're going to focus on today in this top influence or rank.
Kristin, thank you. This is Ainsley speaking. Kristin's done a wonderful job of laying the background to the work of Professor Hattie, and we should also underscore the fact that this has taken about anywhere from 25 to 30 years of his professional career. Working alongside him and along with many other researchers around the world in terms of the research that they have done, whether it's Bob Marzano or otherwise, one of his closest colleagues would be Dr. Vivian Robinson, whose quote you see on this slide now. The more leaders focus their relationships, their work, and their learning on the core business of teaching and learning, the greater the influence on student outcomes. And so the core business is what I think we need to be focusing on, and in particular, and that's why we titled this first webinar, The Assessment Capable Learner, and as Kristin has just pointed out, that comes in with an effect size of 1.44 and therefore represents about 3 years' worth of academic growth. So what we'd like to do now, given that you have been listening for quite some time, we'd like to give you the opportunity to do some reflection. And here's what we would ask you to do. Given that, as Kristin has just mentioned, that 95% of everything seems to work, we really are trying to identify what works best, because as in the words of Professor Hattie, all you need is a beating heart. And so the assessment capable learner, which comes in at 1.44, we would like you to think about now, given your classroom or given your school or given your district, as we have a wide variety of participants on this webinar, I'm going to ask you to take a couple of minutes, if you would, please. 3 minutes, if you would think about, from your own lens, from your own perspective, what does an assessment-capable learner look like, feel like, and sound like? We'll be back in 3 minutes. Okay, we're back. Stephanie has been monitoring your responses, and we're going to give her an opportunity at this point just to share some of the feedback that we've received.
We have folks saying it looks like engaged, prepared, excited, self-motivated, organized, articulate, inquisitive, conscientious, eager to learn. Feels like a growth mindset, confident in what he or she knows, asks questions. Able to identify a learning target or success criteria and make developmentally appropriate decisions, i.e. self-assess, to move towards mastery of that target independently. An assessment-capable learner can verbalize the learning targets feel confident in his or her abilities to reach the learning target and looks like a highly engaged student. Assessment-capable learners take responsibility for their learning. Quite simply, the student is in control. The teacher has established a learning environment in which the perfunctory tasks during the day do not distract, and listening, reading, and reflection are huge. Sounds like asks questions, shares knowledge, talks with peers, self-motivated, open to new ideas, eager to share and ask questions. They can tell what they're learning and how they've learned it. They can provide examples of growth. Responsible, rigorous, conversationalist, engaged, frustrated, collaborator, happy, and eager.
Okay, great. Thank you, Stephanie. Well, given the responses that I've just heard and looking back at the initial question that Kristin had asked each of you, I think you are much too humble in terms of the level of knowledge that you seem to have around this topic, because many of you have hit very closely to what the characteristics are that Professor Hattie and his colleagues have identified as assessment-capable learners. So take a look at your list now that you have just provided and the one that Stephanie has read out loud for all of us. I'm going to show you a short little video clip of 2 students, in fact 4 students. Hopefully the sound will be, you'll be able to hear it clearly. But take a look at your list and then we're going to process it immediately following the video clip.
Co-created success criteria and exemplars of effective pieces of writing that included the reader's thinking behind their inference. With these tools to guide their conferences, students met in pairs to give descriptive feedback to each other about their writing. Their thoughtful and respectful responses reflected a clear understanding of the success criteria and the purpose of the conference.
Okay, eyes up on the orange board, please. So we're going to move into some writing time. Everyone will be working in their writer's notebooks. And I'm going to have a couple of conferences. Okay. We've done a lot of work with this success criteria in our writing, correct? Okay. So remember, our learning target is you're trying to automatically and independently proofread so our writing makes sense. Okay. All right. And just like we've been using, just a reminder that you can come up and use the exemplars as we're trying to improve on our own. And I'm going to meet with everyone to keep updating their learning goals.
So the question says to describe the course characteristics and support your inference with the examples which were selected from your own experience. It says, the course characteristic was that he is very smart because learning sense, not much water, but better than none, so that he tells you that he's grateful that he has some water. So, but then you thought he also is very clever, because when he saw the rocks, he knew that if he put the rocks inside the jug of water, it would rise so he can actually get the water. So after when he filled the jug with rocks, he could drink the water he needed. So I thought you did a really good explanation of your inference. You did a lot of good own ideas, but you might be a little bit more tech support with your inference. Thanks. I think I should add more text evidence too, because right here I think I added too much schema. I didn't have enough text evidence. I need 3 evidence in text. Growth characteristics was that he is very smart, because when it said when he's smart, I didn't explain how he was smart in the text. I just said it was smart for my schema. And said, so it tells me that he is grateful for what he has. But that is also from my schema too, so it's not really from the text.
Okay, so we're going to give you again some opportunity now to reflect on what you've seen and heard. Given what you told us just a few minutes ago about what you thought were your definitions of an assessment-capable learner, apply that to what you've just seen, the 2 little boys talking about their peer review and their writing. What were some of the things that you noticed? What were some of the things that you heard? And include, if you would please, some of the instructions that you might have heard the teacher make before you saw the two boys giving their feedback to each other. We'll give you about 3 minutes to do that. Okay, welcome back. Thank you so much for your contributions. Once again, we're going to ask Stephanie to share some of what has shown up on our screens.
Okay. Some feedback here. Notice the boys each listened to the feedback and acknowledged it. Clear learning targets for students, shared and referred to. Students own the targets because they mentioned them in their peer conferences. The teacher exuded complete confidence in her students. Her interaction reflected on obvious respect for the skills of her students. Teacher shared learning target clearly and had examples up for students to check as they were working. Students were very aware of the terminology in proofreading and editing. Teacher referenced the learning targets. There were exemplars for student reference. The boys were using academically proper terminology in their feedback and reflection. They know where they are, where they need to go, and how to get there. Learning target, success criteria kicked off the lesson. Feedback was ongoing and relevant. Clarity of the learning target, exemplars were readily available as a resource. Students were analytical and thinking critically, willingness to receive feedback. Students had a clear understanding of what they needed to include in the piece of writing. The discussion was respectful and productive with a goal of improvement for both students. Heard reference to learning goals, exemplars, learning targets, students possibly tracking their learning along the way. Learning targets were posted. Exemplars are present to strive to improve individual students' work. She may have requested that peer feedback included referring to exemplars. Teacher asked students to reflect on their learning. Students talked about what they could do to improve their understanding of the lesson. The boys had been taught to use exemplars to determine the level of success. They have been taught clear criteria, and this has provided them with the language to use with a partner. They give specific feedback and suggestions for improvement. Students were using vocabulary that seemed to have been used in lesson, i.e. text support. I appreciated hearing the common language of assessment used and understood by both teacher and students. Quite fascinating watching the students' use of vocabulary in giving feedback. The teacher has modeled. This confidence was reflected by the two students. This task could have been overwhelming in terms of the abstractness of the cognitive challenge. They handled better than I would have. Their insights were spot on. Criteria for assignment was posted and references to exemplars were available. Students were reflective in their conversation with each other. Both students were clear on the standards that comprised mastery of the concept. They had clarity about the component parts of the concept and made use of the exemplars and could explain their feedback and the rationale behind the feedback.
Okay, that's excellent, Stephanie. Thank you again. Ladies and gentlemen, it's quite evident that you've captured the essence of what that little video was all about, and clearly are gaining an understanding about what we really refer to as assessment-capable learners. Given that now, what we want to do is to share with you a little bit about what Dr. Hattie has come up with regards to his thinking around assessment-capable learners. So given what you have just said, I'm going to share the next several slides with you to help advance your own thinking about this work and maybe give you a perspective that is slightly different than what I've heard in terms of the responses. Before I do, however, I just want to acknowledge that a couple of people have mentioned the beeping that you're hearing in the background, and unfortunately that's not something within our control because it essentially occurs through the software when people are popping in or out of the call, or their calls may have been dropped. So we do apologize, of course, but we'll try, hopefully it'll be at a minimum. So the first slide, as you can see here, which you've probably already had a chance to read, talking about the students are able to talk about their next steps in their learning. This is really critical because the three essential questions that we want all students to be able to respond to, which Dr. Hattie has laid out, and it comes from the work of Roy Sadler and Paul Black and Dylan Williams, some of the assessment experts that have been doing this work for a long time. Stated slightly differently, but essentially what we're talking about is that students are able to know their targets, in other words, know where they're going, know how they're going, or otherwise, to translate in our terms in North America, how they're doing, and then finally, where to next. In other words, what am I going to do next? And the catchphrase that Professor Hattie uses, which I think is a really appropriate one, is for students to be able to answer the question, what do I do when I don't know what to do? So that's one of the first conditions, if you will, of a description about assessment-capable learner. The second is that they are active participants in their learning. Too often, and this goes with one of his 9 mind frames where he talks about understanding clearly the difference between monologue and dialogue. Students need to be challenged, need to be working together, need to be in a position where cognitive dissonance is present, where they are challenged with their current understanding about what learning is really all about. And that's brought about by the degree to which, of course, the teacher gives ownership and responsibility to the students for their learning. So they are clearly active participants, as opposed to what we still see in many classrooms, that they are simply recipients of knowledge, and the teacher's job is to pour this information into their heads, rather than allowing students the opportunity to discover, to challenge their misunderstandings about their current knowledge on a particular topic. The third element has to do with the fact that students clearly understand what assessment is all about. And it was Rick Stiggins who made a really good point about this in his work in assessment here in North America, when he talked about the importance of student involvement in classroom assessment. And so when we talk about understanding assessment tools, how they're used and what the results mean, we know from the work of Ruth Sutton that simply giving grades does not allow the students to be able to answer the 3 essential questions: where am I going, how am I going, and where to next. So here, the important feature that we need to bear in mind that assessment-capable learners are ones that can actually participate and help co-create the criteria by which they're going to be judged in their work, so that students can self-assess, self-monitor, and self-regulate. The next element has to do with the importance of them understanding this notion of learning intentions and success criteria, an example of which you can see on this slide. There are many of these now that we're seeing popping up in schools across North America, and of course it's part of the way of life for schools in Australia and New Zealand and other parts of the world that are using this work of Professor Hattie. But the important aspect of this is that very often what you see is that learning objectives or learning goals are posted on the classroom blackboards or smart boards as we now see them in classrooms, but very often what's missing are the success criteria. In order for a student to become assessment capable, they need to have a clear understanding about what success is going to look like before they ever engage in the task that they're assigned by the teacher. And so if we co-create success criteria with the students, there's a greater likelihood that kids are going to know while they're doing the activity, while they're doing the learning activity, what success is going to look like, and therefore their final response will presumably be at a greater level, greater depth that is, and they would have greater understanding. And then, of course, once again, the importance of success criteria is that students can self-regulate. It's the highest form of feedback when students are able to provide themselves with the metacognitive strategies to be able to think about where they are with their learning, and that the teacher is able to provide them with feedback based on the success criteria that the students and the teachers created together. Another aspect, of course, is that students are able to set smarter goals and monitor their progress. Goal setting based on their previous performance is essential because kids would need to be able to answer where to next, and where to next is based on the evidence that they have been given with respect to where they currently are with their learning. So the notion of setting smarter goals. Now, one of the things that we would point out here is we're probably all familiar with the acronym SMART: specific, measurable, attainable, reliable, and time-bound. But interestingly enough, in this work, Dr. Hattie has altered the letter A to be not just attainable, but ambitious, because very often what we find is students tend to set goals that are far below and sort of expect that they can't perform at higher levels. And as Professor Hattie would say, we should never help students meet their targets. We should always help students exceed their targets, and that's why we want to set ambitious goals. The next slide, of course, I've already spoken to, and that is that assessment-capable students, assessment-capable learners are able to answer these three questions. So if you, as a supervisor or as a principal, or for that matter as a teacher, if you were to go around your classroom while learning was going on and were to ask your students, what are you doing and why are you doing it, they would probably be able to couch their answers with respect to these three essential questions: where am I going, how am I going, and where I'm going next. And so as we continue doing this work, we need to also understand that while learning is occurring, students must have some means of being able to track their progress. And of course, the methodologies that we're more than familiar with is the notion of creating rubrics and exemplars. Exemplars, of course, as you saw in the little video clip, were samples of student work that would allow students to self-assess according to what the criteria are, and to give them examples posted in the classroom around the room on any given topic about what progress looks like. So students can then take a look at what they're doing based on the rubrics and the exemplars, and can then self-regulate their learning while learning is taking place rather than when it's too late at the end. Let me stop there and give you an opportunity if there are any questions that you have that we can respond to. That's a fair bit of information, so we'll take 3 minutes or so, and Stephanie will start to compile any questions that you have, and Kristin and I will do our best to respond to them. We'll be back in about 3 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Thank you again for your questions. Some of them were comments, and some we'll come back to because they probably are more helpful at the end once we've finished with the research part of this work. Stephanie, would you mind sharing some of the questions, please?
Sure. From Tara, she's asking, are success criteria and targets, are they for a unit or a day?
Okay, success criteria really are for a unit of instruction, depending on the length of time. I know in some of the work that we do, we talk about a unit of instruction being anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks in length, and so that would be the notion that you would create learning intentions and success criteria around that unit of instruction, so that there's an expectation at the end when you've done your pre-test and then you've done a post-test, and at the end, of course, the success criteria would be things that students would be looking at while they were doing that particular learning activity, so they can judge where they were in terms of the progress along that unit of instruction. Another one?
Karen is not actually asking a question, but just wanted to say that she's really excited about this work and how it can help educators be more effective, especially in this time of increased expectations for student learning and accountability for such. Very cool.
Thanks very much, Karen. We'll certainly make a point at the end of this presentation to talk a little bit more about how we can expand this work for educators across our country. Thanks for those questions. I'll continue to share some. Oh, sorry?
I have more.
Oh, we do have more questions. Sorry.
Coming in.
Wonderful.
Jenny is asking, what are teachers going to need to learn in order to accomplish this atmosphere in the classroom?
Jenny, that's an outstanding question, and probably will go beyond the scope of the 1 hour that we have made available for this particular webinar, but we will attempt at the end, I'll ask Kristin to come back and sort of share some of the thoughts that we have about how we might be able to do that for our colleagues and educators and professionals here in North America. It's certainly a very appropriate kind of a question. You're absolutely correct. One of the things that Dr. Hattie talks about specifically in his second book, which is Visible Learning for Teachers, is the notion of mind frames. He's identified 9 mind frames that are required for educators to be able to do this work, and you certainly have to start with that as a perspective. We have to change our thinking about how schooling and what schooling and learning looks like in our current context. And without that having a mind shift with regards to this work, then it tends to be that we will continue to do the things that we've always done and not achieve the kinds of levels of success that we would expect from our schools and our students. So thank you again for those questions. We'll just continue on with sharing some of the information that we've got for you. In doing so, though, we know that reflection, metacognitive strategies have a really high effect size. In fact, they come in at 0.69. So for the people who've asked about, in fact, there was a question now that I'm thinking about it. People did ask, well, what does 0.4 actually represent? When we talk about a year, we're talking about an academic year. So for every year that a student has been in school, Dr. Hattie suggests that there should be 1 year of academic growth, and that's what the 0.4 represents. So the questions that we want you to consider then from a reflective perspective, and we're not necessarily asking you for responses here, but feel free to do so. And we'll give you a couple of minutes for each one. You may want to simply scribe these, if you will, and give some thought to them later on when you have more time. But we think that these are essential questions. There are many more, but we've selected just a handful about what educators, regardless of what role you play, need to be considering. For example, the first one is there a shared view of what good learner characteristics are in a school or in a district? So take a minute, if you would, please, and if you're working with a notebook beside you, you might want to simply bullet a few thoughts or ideas around this. There are about 4 questions that we have for you, so this is a chance for you to do some self-reflection, if you would. We'll be back in a minute. Okay, welcome back. Here's your second question. And this is a really interesting one because one of the thoughts is that, and I think it was Michael Fullen who once said that terms travel easy, concepts rarely follow. So is there a shared language of learning in your school and in your district? Once again, take a minute if you would, please, and jot some ideas down about that. And we're back. Your third question is this. Do students know from teachers and leaders what being a good learner looks like? We'll be back in a minute.
Ainsley, I really liked that third question in particular regarding students being able to articulate what good learners do, what they look like, what the practices of good learners are. It really makes me ponder a lot about the levels of student voice that would be in my school, and if my students are able to articulate what I speak to them every single day. So thank you for sharing that question in particular.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Kristin. So the fourth question then, before we start to write up, to wrap up, so does the school have a focus on learning and progress as opposed to teaching and achievement? And I would ask a follow-up to this. How do you know? What is your evidence? Take a minute if you would, please. Okay, so welcome back. Thank you for taking the moment or so to consider those 4 questions. They are 4 from among many others that we have in terms of getting educators and professionals to look at self-reflecting on some of these issues. There was a question earlier in the webinar where people wanted to see this particular slide again, so we popped it up there. But as we draw to a close, I'm going to ask Kristin to come back in and take us through to the last little piece. Any of this information, of course, will be archived, and if you have specific questions, obviously, at the end, then certainly send those through, and we'd be glad to respond long after this webinar is over. Let's move to near the end of this slide.
Okay, and so, it was fabulous to hear the question about, how do we start this at our sites? I mean, I think what I enjoyed most about the question is you were right to identify that this doesn't just happen by accident. It's definitely not something where, you hear the students in the video who are articulating their learning steps, they were giving each other feedback, and the high levels of learning that was happening between those students does not happen overnight or as a result of maturation by any means. It's the result of deliberate teaching and facilitating of the learning. My favorite phrase about visible learning is actually the mission of the work as it continues in the field, and basically states that visible learning happens when teachers see learning through the eyes of the students, and students see themselves as their own teachers. And that is a remarkable journey for any educator and student to be on. At Corwin, we have put multiple pieces in place to help you with your journey alongside our partner in Cognition. And so the first one is coming up very quickly and is our large kind of face-to-face launch event that is happening. Dr. Hattie is actually flying from Melbourne to join us in the Los Angeles area on October 10th and 11th and for a 2-day event. It will be him, 2 of our New Zealand colleagues from Cognition, Ainsley, and we will be covering the key principles of visible learning and providing ways for you to immediately reflect and take action and use this knowledge to really begin that journey at your site. And you can see the information about that below. In addition, we offer the professional development seminars and services around visible learning to begin your journey. We have offerings that highlight the research and the foundation of the research and help you truly understand it. Then we have offerings that actually provide a matrix as to what a visible learning school would look like and help guide and shape the thinking and walk participants through a journey of your own evidence gathering to really start putting these practices that yield greater than 0.4 growth over 1 year's time into effect. And that's a fabulous professional development series with multi-offerings to meet your needs, customized to your site. We also offer resources, including we resell Visible Learning and Visible Learning for Teachers, and each of our trainings come with rich training manuals and materials available that way too. But the biggest thing that we wanted you to have today was a chance to reflect on the greatest practice that was highlighted in John's research that gets almost 4 times the growth that we would expect in a year over 1 year's time, and that is the practice of creating assessment-capable learners. And we hope that through our questions today, through showing you the interaction of the students in the video and giving you some of the research and information that yields how to actually move to creating those learners on your site, that you're able to start a journey and think about teaching, learning, and leadership differently. So on behalf of Ainsley and myself and the rest of Corwin, we just want to thank you so much for your time. If you hopped onto this a little late, this will be archived. and we will be sending out the information to you after this event. So this will be the first of many events just like this on behalf of Corwin to continue your visible learning journey. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.